Staying attuned, a poetic gaze, backwards and forward, with folks both brilliant and humble.
Grain-dusted hands, articulate beating heart, a rare passionate. Our guest today is Josh Bellamy. He is a baker and co-owner of Boulted Bread here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Like all our guests, he has many other things too, and we will dive into that now. All right, so I'm going to read an essayette, which I learned is a small essay.
Okay.
It's very short, but it's a cute word.
Okay.
The poet of privilege. Awful things are happening in the world day in and day out, and this poet seems content to ignore them. Focusing on a seemingly privileged viewshed, they write with such intensity, but nothing of war, corruption, environmental devastation, or anything even remotely political. They write about tasty meals, sunsets, and sex. They write about personal struggles with trauma, mental health, and addiction. And they write with such fervor of things commonplace and things idiosyncratic and things funny and things sad. They can only get through each awful day in the awful world by focusing on the themes that serve respite from tragedy. And their intention is to reduce trends towards nihilism and cynicism by focusing on other stuff, hopefully giving them and those others who consume their work a break from the misery of the brokenness of it all.
All right. I think I was trying to think of words, or words were popping into my head, and the three words that popped into my head and in this order were guilt, selfishness, and then altruism at the very end. And I don't know, I think that that essayette sort of probably touches on, I don't know how people live their lives in a war-torn nation. Obviously, I'm a baker of privilege. But I do think that a lot of folks running around out there in the world are probably pretty self-centered, not necessarily in a bad way. I'm interacting with the world through my senses and my brain. You're doing the same thing, and if I were able to look through the world through your lens in your brain, I'd probably find it insane, and likewise, right? We're all sort of experiencing the world in with whatever biology we have available to us. So I don't know if it if the guilt is and selfishness is really, if those are exactly valid, if we're all sort of doing the same thing. I'm making a lot of leaps in logic here that...
Yeah. Well, tell me more about the altruism.
Well, I think at the end, the essayette sort of spoke on the utility of their poetry being written by the privileged poet, right? Probably there are many purposes and goals of the privileged poet, but one of them is to provide an additional filter to make sort of an insane world sane for all of us, Yeah,
an additional filter to make an insane world more sane for more of us or all of us. Yeah. I'll just say that, I never fully know what I'm going to read. I chose that one at the last minute. It was between like two. So, but I'm super happy with that read, especially this idea of, like we can take it and talk about the privileged baker as you called yourself, right? And I think your adoption of that already, I feel very happy that you have the self-awareness and the empathy for renaming, like switching out the word poet with baker and seeing it as all the same. But the altruistic aspect that you said about providing essentially a lens, which I wrote in here as a respite or relief, right, from tragedy. From boredom, from war, from terrible things happening. I mean, it's, I guess it's what all, I feel like what I was writing about is maybe what all art can do.
Yeah, it's like a little sanctity, like, but I do wonder, like, all right, so to continue this, and I don't, I can't imagine your poetry is this way. I imagine that you're the privileged poet in this, potentially. But maybe not. But I do wonder, like, where the sort of, like, filter or sanctity ends and, like, a distraction to the detriment of the consumer begins. Like, I am certainly guilty of walking around the world with blinders on about a lot of things, about a lot of problems. And oftentimes I will use art or entertainment as like an escape, where maybe my energy would be better spent. I don't know. Considering
so
these,
you're talking about less of you being the producer, but more the consumer of
right.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I want folks to, like, come into the bakeries and, like, get a little bit of respite, right? Like, I want it to be ultimately, like, the best part of their day. To come in, it feels warm, you get a smile, a croissant, a nice cup of coffee, a bagel sandwich, whatever. And maybe, like, no matter how shitty the rest of your day is, like, your boss chews you out, or, like, you had a flat tire, whatever. Which are all pretty minimal compared to, like, growing up in a war-torn country or something like that.
Yeah.
But still shitty in their own way. But, I do think there's, like, sometimes you can cling on to those distractions a little too much.
Again, coming back to as the producer,
as the consumer, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, how about as the producer?
Well, maybe as a producer, I do think that that's, like, something that you probably should question, right? Like, why am I making this? Like, what purpose is it serving for most of the customers that come in here?
Yeah.
But that gets a little shifty too, like.
Right. But okay, so let me ask you this, just to make you feel shittier about your privilege. How does one feel in the food industry, right? Making, as a lot of artists do, right, like artwork that is only attainable to those with resources. So there's plenty of hungry people, or directly, who are not eating croissants.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm not doing that. I wrote the privilege poet of privilege. I clearly was celebrating that vantage and my sort of apathy, maybe.
Yeah.
But how do you wrestle with that, just to get the more guilt view brought in of your three words?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. And, like, I make my livelihood from it, right? Like, and I wouldn't make that livelihood, or I'd make less of a livelihood if we charged less and it was more attainable for wider swath of humanity with different economic resources. That is a constant question I have for myself. I don't know if I have a straight answer for you, but I've had sort of this, I mean, so the bakery's been open for a decade now, and it's sort of constantly on my mind of like, what, all right, if I may, I did break it down into this Venn diagram, right? And I think of it as like 3 circles in this Venn diagram.
Yeah.
One is you charge a fair price, so an affordable price for your products. The other circle is you use high quality ingredients. And the third circle is you pay your people a healthy wage so that they can survive.
Yeah.
You really can only do, or I've only ever been able to figure out how to do 2 of those things well. At once.
Yeah.
Trying to do all 3 things well at the same time, you end up just doing all 3 of those things pretty poorly. You can't pay your people as well as you can. You gotta cut corners on the ingredients that you use, and you can maybe provide a slight discount, but it's not gonna be as affordable where it like makes sense, right? And I can't really, I haven't been able to figure out a way to make all 3 of those things work in unison. And maybe I'm just not being creative enough. But, so I think that we've, for me at least, I can't personally compromise on ingredients because I think, even if we charged half as much for the stuff that we made, I would feel guilty using shittier ingredients to feed hungry people.
Yeah.
I think that, and everyone works their ass off at the shop. So like I can't, and I'd still like to pay everyone more. So I don't really, it's like the concession has to come on the price side of things. In other countries, there are, social safety net's a loaded term, but there are subsidies for farmers so that grain costs less, so that butter costs less for bakers. And so that, let's take France, for instance, they can charge around $1.50, $2 for a nice organic baguette, or a croissant might be $1 or $2 because their ingredient cost is lower because it's being subsidized by the government. That's not the case in the United States, so we don't really have that here. But I don't know. It's some guilt that I wrestle with all the time.
Yeah, I just thought you brought that word in as one of your 3 words, and I wanted to hit on that for a second because that just seemed like low-hanging, probably an incredibly frustrating paradox or problem.
It's probably the word that pops into my head 9 times out of 10, just because I feel so guilty all the time. I probably should go to therapy or something. It's like I just walk around racked with guilt,
Yeah. Well, and so I'm going to come back to the way that poem pacifies me. I mean, I'm watching how it kind of came to be, right? So I'm watching, Instagram story after story sharing an opinion about Israel, Gaza, abortion, a variety of issues that I care about. But I don't really get to, they don't really enter my art too much directly.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I thought about, is that because I'm not trying to take a side and alienate certain people because I want my art to be as reached for as possible, whether that's to make me something or to give back something? Or is that just a sort of I don't want to spend my days thinking about that. I would rather think about the way the light's filtering through the leaves. And I don't really know. I'm very aware of the fact that it could just be a coping mechanism for me as a consumer and a producer to simply say, I'm privileged, I'm aware of that, I make sort of political decisions based on who I vote for, who I support, and I make the impact at a very individual, intellectual level. I guess I'm just not sure myself, and I know you didn't ask it of me, but I just wanted to tell you that that poem is not filled with certainty. It sounds very certain because that day I was thinking, I'm just going to respond to all these people who never asked, but probably wonder why I am, focused on fossilized French fries in the crevice of my seats in the car. Like that to me is interesting, fun, and ultimately just kind of, that's something that my lens goes towards. But I think the lens, as you said, to make the world, an insane world, a little saner, is very personal to everyone and what they choose to do to adopt more sanity. Because 9 times out of 10, that word popping up and being sort of riddled with guilt is to me a life for me to live that way, because I've lived many terrible ways. Yeah. Is potentially me wasting my life when I could be not just hedonistically indulging, but being part of something that is just not so constrained by emotions that are very guilt for me is a word that's really emotion or feeling, however you define it. It's really ineffective, for most of the time. Because it's oftentimes just a feeling that leads to shame. And ultimately, those are places that you have no power to change anything from. You know what I mean? And at the very basic level, I just feel like if I have 80 years, half of them are spent, how do I want to spend the other? And I'm just guessing, or just thinking or feeling that guilt is something I don't want to direct my time.
Yeah.
But
well, all right, so can we back up for a second?
Any way you want to go.
I guess my question to you, and maybe this is a tough question to answer, would be who did you write that for? Did you write it for yourself? I guess, who do you write for in general? Do you write for a anonymous consumer? Or do you write for Sam and hope that the consumer enjoys it too? That there are...
Yeah. So I think, I mean, at its base, I'm not writing... I know I can't create if I'm thinking about, well, what does someone want to consume? I'm not thinking that way, because that is the sort of antithesis of creation in my realm. For me, it's firstly a joyous act that I lose all self-consciousness and I'm in flow doing something. And for me, that's a variety of things that I'm just a novice at, including writing. And when I can get into that state, right, where the flow state, which we probably we both get into, that's just a fun way to spend my life. And I mean, okay, so that's that. The second part being do I make it for others? I mean, in an altruistic way, part of the reason I write poetry and I'm not super obtuse about my choice of words, and it's very straightforward, is that I want it to be consumed by as many people as possible. And ultimately, they're basic philosophical treatise of mine, or something that I've come to learn, something I've come to observe, that I truly believe is like comedy in essence. Just like a joke works when someone articulates something on stage that you've always thought, but never have said aloud or never heard anyone else acknowledge. And then the whole fucking place is laughing. You're like, everyone fucking pees in the shower, whatever, right? That's what I want when a group of people are listening to me read my poetry. I want them to feel something not all different. I don't want it to be open to that much interpretation. I want it to be pretty straightforward what it is. So I think with that in mind, I am writing for a particular impact, not for a particular person, I mean, I write things that are clearly related to my wife, and those have a certain like person in mind. And occasionally I write things to other people that have a certain person in mind. But oftentimes it's something that I just want it to be easily enjoyed. And by easily, it obviously means a certain level of like,
it's palatable.
It's palatable to those that have greater linguistic, you know, English capabilities. Then they can see some of those trickier aspects. But those that don't can easily get by them. It's kind of like a good Disney movie that the parents enjoy in different ways than the kids do. Disney wrote the whole thing for a variety of ages at once, you know? I also want my work to be sort of understood and felt by people with a pretty basic understanding of the language as well as philosophy or anything like that.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I hope that somewhat answers it.
Yeah.
But if I flip it back, like, and it's totally cool if you want to talk on baking or if you want to go anywhere else in a creative endeavor that you do. But the question is, and if you have different answers for different creative endeavors and modalities, like, let me know. But who are you creating for?
Well, all right, so I think to like hit on the second word that popped into my head, selfishness. I think that, I mean, my creative endeavor is baking. It also happens to be my profession too. And sometimes that's a tenuous relationship, but more often than not, it tends to work out well. I started the bakery for selfish reasons. I wanted to bake a loaf of bread that existed in my head. And I knew I wouldn't be able to do that on someone else's terms, I guess. So I guess you could say it's changed over time. I think a decade ago, I baked for myself, and it worked out well. We were able to pay the bills on the shop, just sort of selfishly baking. But a really amazing thing happened over the last decade, which is that other people liked the stuff, and that the space itself, the bakery, became so much more than what we made there. Certainly that drew people in, but it maybe it was this way from the jump, but it sort of has definitely evolved into like, I don't know, like you were saying earlier, like this sort of like almost nexus in the community, you know, like this gathering space for people who have become my friend, you know, and like I think that now, so for personally, that it's sort of shifted over time where I would say I probably still 90% of the time bake for myself, but there's a little bit more confidence in my vision, right? Of like, okay, these folks are along for the ride. They're probably going to like my version of whatever comes out next, or our version of whatever comes out next, right? Like it's, so there probably is some selfishness left in there, but it's like, oh man, I bet the folks that come in here might like a whatever kind of croissant that we sort of bake in a bolted way. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely shifted over time. I would say like at the bagel shop, I really, really, really wanted to please my son. He is a harsh critic, downright mean sometimes. And so I would, every Thursday at Boulted, I would practice baking bagels for, I think, a couple of years before we opened Benchwarmers. It was like my Thursday afternoon project. And every like Thursday I would bring him home and like, you know, sort of like nervously sit it down in front of him, and he would take a bite and just rip it to shreds, you know, like just brutal honesty from like a 3-year-old kid. And then finally he like bit it and was like, this isn't disgusting, like you should make these. I was like, yes, like, all right, thanks dude, awesome.
So you started a bagel shop.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was like, now we can do it. So I'd say, I mean, I think that I've made some concessions over the years on that, like, selfish baking, or like what I want out of a loaf of bread. Our stuff, we bake pretty dark, and if it were up to me and I was the consumer, the only consumer, we'd probably bake it a lot darker. But I think we've hit like a nice compromise, you know, in what we produce. So
yeah. So that was great. I think, like, you know, what I heard was starting out a much greater deal of selfishness. But that's, I mean, and then over time, selfishness gives way to confidence.
Mm-hmm.
But that confidence is part of the fact that you are, like, employing more people, livelihoods depending on it. Ultimately, a base, a community who's come to expect certain things, maybe baked not as dark as you want them.
Right.
So, yeah, that seems to be a really healthy understanding and self-awareness of how it must work if you want to be successful doing what you said at the beginning, right? Which is your passion as your vocation.
Right.
But I want to know more about that. Like, how do you feed other passions that are not your vocation? Because everyone talks about, as soon as you start making money on this thing, it changes, your relationship with this thing changes. What has your experience been?
That's not been my experience with baking, and I think mostly I've just been really lucky. I don't really know. I really don't spend a ton of time investigating my relationship with baking too much, because I'm afraid I'll demystify it maybe for myself. It's a profoundly, I mean, at least for me, it's a deep relationship. I get a lot of satisfaction out of it. Like it's I don't know. It's where I feel like I'm the most me, right? When I'm in front of the oven. It's stuff like this, or out in the world. Basically, when I step foot away from the oven, I have to put on a little show. Whereas, like, in front of the oven, locked in, I can just sort of lose myself and be in a flow state or whatever. Like, I don't have to wear a costume. So that hasn't disappeared, though, over the years. I would say that I do it less, just necessarily. I bake less than I ever have in the past, average.
You're directing more.
Right. And that's been a challenge, just sort of adopting that role as like a manager or director, or as like an owner, you know, like, I'm uncomfortable with that. That doesn't put me in flow state. Like, it doesn't get my rocks off or whatever, you know, like, so, but I don't know, like, I feel like I've got a pretty good grasp on, like, the understanding that I need to be good at that, and I need to work hard at that in order to continue allowing space for time in front of the oven. Less than it was, but, like, if it's going to continue and survive for the next 20 or 30 years, like, I do need to take a step back from sort of the selfish flow state baking and be a little bit more of like a director from outside of things. And I feel pretty comfortable with that. Like, and that hasn't been the case. Like, I fought it as much as I possibly could, and, like, Sam, who's my partner at the shop, could probably speak to this. Like, early on, he's like, hey man, you need to stop working so much. I need help running the shop. You need to take a day off and take a step back. And my wife told me this, same thing, and it was, you know, tough on our marriage and tough on my relationship with Sam. Like, I didn't want to give it up, because that was the important part of it for me. Like, I didn't open this shop to be a manager. I didn't open this shop to be a director. I opened the shop so I could bake the bread that I want to bake every day. And Sam was right, and my wife was right, and you know, whatever. Like I've apologized to them, you know, like, but.
Why were they right?
Well, I think that what happened is that it like consumed me maybe a little too much, and this thing that you know was you know, it became like sort of an unhealthy relationship maybe, like between me and the bread, right? Like I lost sight of the other important things in my life. And my relationship with Sam, my relationship with my family, any semblance of like a social life that extended outside of the confines of the bakery, like all that sort of like took a pretty big hit the first several years we were open.
Yeah.
And you know, it was so important to me that the shop be successful and that it work and that the bread turned out perfectly and the pastries turned out perfectly that, you know, I just, I didn't know another way. And anyway, it took several years to sort of back out of that, you know, and like become comfortable as a manager and become comfortable letting some things go. But I think that I have a lot more balance in my life now, you know. I miss being here all the time, and I miss being in flow state every day. And I think that, like, for me at least, baking was something that I had to do on a daily basis in order to access that flow state often. But the other aspects of my life are more well-rounded now, and I think that you know, I'm probably a happier or maybe more satisfied person for that. But you know, every day it's a struggle.
Well, it seems like
we got into the weeds on this, huh?
It's
hey, pulling it out of me, Sam.
That's where
I'm
we
sweaty.
go. It's okay.
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's great. It wasn't until I kicked my water over that I realized I had one. You need any?
I'm good. Thank you, though.
So, but I guess what's interesting about that, there's a lot of things that are interesting, but it just seems like somehow something changed, right? And you acknowledge you weren't going to therapy. What was that transformation? Like, I mean, they just convinced you of it, or you just fatigued to a point you realized you were losing relationships, or?
I mean, I did go to therapy for a little while. Like, I had a couple of therapists in the past few years that were, you know, and I think that process was very helpful for me.
Yeah.
Just having someone to talk to, like I don't know, someone sort of removed from everything that would listen, you know?
Yeah.
I've got some close friends that I've had for my entire life, basically. But even they who love me, you know, unconditionally, but that they're still receiving the words that I'm saying through their like filter of a lifetime with me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so I do think therapy was helpful. I think I got pretty close to hitting, to like fucking up all of my relationships. And like sort of, you know, teeter-tottering on this like line of like, oh, I'm gonna really lose everyone who I really love in the world if I don't make some changes. And, you know, I say they were right because when I was able to take a step back and like really clarify, you know, what I wanted my world to look like, it sort of, you know, I think gave me the capacity to run the shop with Sam as a co-owner and as a partner. And we were able to open a bagel shop and move to a new location and do these things that we needed to do. But I don't know if they would have been possible had I been locked in, you know, baking bread 5 or 6 days a week. And so, like, taking a step back has allowed for like a more sustainable lifestyle for me personally, but also like has allowed for some sustainability for the shops, hopefully for the next few decades, which, like I said, may not have been possible. But yeah, I mean, I almost fucked everything up, and that's a scary place to be, to be, you work hard, go like check all the boxes, try hard in school and like be nice to people and like, grow a life for yourself, and try really hard not to fuck it up. And then you're going to make mistakes. And hopefully those mistakes are big enough to like really help you clarify things, but not so big that you don't squander all of the hard work that you did to get there. It's working out right now.
I guess, thank you for that. I guess, coming back to that question on like, how does one take their passion, merge it with their vocation, and not sort of ruin what their passion is?
Yeah.
It seems like in that response, like not only would your passion have ruined all those relationships, but maybe in reaction to those relationships dying, would have hurt your passion, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, that's just how I was hearing that.
I could like, sort of the pre-Big Bang universe. There's this like void, right? There was nothing there, nothing. That was like the vision I had of my life, right? Where it was like this, everyone was gone who meant something to me, and my identity was completely wiped clean. And like, my identity as a father, as a husband, as a baker, as a friend, as a son, like as a brother, all gone because I couldn't like take a step back from this like selfish pursuit, I guess.
It sounds like you were intoxicated. You mentioned flow, obviously a very intoxicating feeling, and to me, one of the greatest pursuits. Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering if, like, when it becomes pathological, right?
Right.
When it becomes, like, negatively detrimental in a way that, like, okay, there's diminishing returns to my investment in this. It almost sounds like a substance abuser talking about the way their relationships were on the rocks because they kept choosing this thing over that thing.
Yeah. I've got some friends who've had substance abuse struggles in the past, and I wouldn't, I don't know what that's like personally, and so it's like a far jump for me to equate it to that, but it's probably the closest thing I've ever felt personally, like, booze and weed, and like I'm have as healthy of a relationship with those things, I guess, as you can, like,
sure, yeah.
But this thing ruled my life, like it was, and I did chase after the feeling, like every day. It was like I felt incomplete unless, I was pulling really nice stuff out of the oven or like hyped up on crushing my day.
Right. I've been dealing like in response to myself being addicted to these flow states. Been dealing with it since I was in undergrad, and dealing with people that were in my life who were so invested in very addictive ways to very beautiful, benign things, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with baking. It's a very great way to spend your time.
Yeah, it's awesome, yeah.
And your liver's fine, and you're it's not changing your personality, so to speak, but like sometimes the pursuit, when we get back to the original part of the poem where you were talking about when you were asking me questions and I was asking you questions with regard to kind of like, is this an escape for the producer and the consumer? It seems like a lot of times the creator can get so sort of addicted to that state that everything else is really irritating. It's like, again, coming, and I'm talking as an alcoholic myself. It's like taking away that drug, and all of a sudden there's withdrawal symptoms, right, that are very painful. I feel like you mentioned a certain armor or a feeling, a costume you have to put on in the outside world that you don't need next to the oven. And those are just, I don't know, really interesting themes that came out of what I wrote. I want to read one other thing to you, if that's okay.
Yeah.
This is a poem. Sorry. It's just me meditating as I'm not sitting here smoking a cigarette. I must go out like a dog. I am powerless over cigarettes. I really only choose to smoke the first few smokes back, and from then on I am forced out the door, puffing a pack a day, one every 48 minutes or so. If each smoke is a 10-minute affair, I am torching a total of 3 hours and 20 minutes each and every day. What? This is not a ritual, it's habitual. And I, of course, continue to admit my addict minds his business, which is to find no fault in the cycle by dressing up this force to fight withdrawal in a deeply rooted fantasy and a faith for a future smoke to make me feel strong and make me feel calm and make me feel oh so cool.
It's tough when your identity is wrapped up in this thing, right?
Me?
I mean, the universal you know?
I guess, no, I don't know.
What's the last line? The last line again?
Yeah. Make me feel oh so cool.
Calm, strong, oh so cool?
Yeah. And I'm talking about that being the fantasy, yeah.
You're right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, this fantasy of an identity, right, where it's like, sort of, I think if I can turn it around, put the spotlight back on myself. Thank
Please.
you, Sam. It's like, but they're like, yeah, that's where I thought I should be, right? Like, that's where I felt calm, strong, and cool, was in front of the oven. Yeah.
Okay.
You know, and it was, you know, I was probably the only person who felt that way, you know, maybe. And it wasn't giving me lung cancer, but it was having a detrimental impact on my life. Dude, 3 hours a day smoking cigarettes is nuts.
Yeah, I mean, and I honestly, so last Tuesday I put them down. I have like a Zyn pouch in right here, and a patch here, and I've gone 2 months twice in the past 4 years of not smoking, and it takes about a few days to a few weeks. Like a few days, you sort of separate this physiological withdrawal.
Okay.
The patch helps, of course, wean you because it's giving you a little bit of nicotine, and then when you might be triggered, well, I mean, everything's a trigger to smoke a cigarette.
Yeah.
You're in your car, you're on your phone, you're not in the car, you're not on the phone.
Right.
It's all a trigger for a cigarette. But the point being that, like, I have to conceptualize of how illogical this is to break the psychological. Because if I don't call my identity false, if I don't see it as a fantasy, it will continue to rule me.
Yeah.
And what I've learned more than anything, 10 months sober from all other substances, is like, I have to reprogram my identity, but it's not actually anything but a relief. Because I was never that guy. That was just some caricature that I thought I was, and I you know, like, I had an Instagram account all about hedonism and indulgence of $300 bottles of champagne, and it was all stupid.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like beautifully photographed, well sourced, thoughtful, but ultimately not stupid, but like I just have time for doing stuff like this now. And I'm like present in a way that I wasn't before. So it's like, I guess to answer that, not that you asked that question directly, but the answer to any question about doesn't it hurt to acknowledge your fantasy, your identity was part fantasy, I think is the most empowering thing one could do, because we're all filled with all of these sort of like schema of like who we should be.
Yeah.
And oftentimes when we remove that pressure, we just see that it wasn't really paying the dividends we thought it was anyway.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, like we shapeshift and we reveal, I guess, like with further marble carved away, like the sculpture that was already there.
Yeah.
You know, like that's where I'm headed.
Hopefully that's the goal, right? Like I wonder how many folks stay trapped in the marble.
Well, I think
that's terrifying to me, you know, personally. It's just like, man, like,
right.
Is there...
Well, you have to reframe that for a second, because I actually don't believe you ever get out of the marble. As soon as you think you're done carving...
I'm out.
Yeah?
Yeah,
okay.
This is all I get. This is it. This is my last one, dude. It's depressing, but here I am.
for me, I think, like I said, I'm at halftime. And, like, ultimately, it'll get easier.
Yeah.
And I think that's just part of wisdom, as it's always been described, is ultimately wisdom is equal to how much experience you've had that you've processed and made sense of. Therefore, the playbook for future is just written by all the voluminous pages of past processed shit. So it becomes easier and easier, and you're making smaller and smaller refinements to get to the final sculpture that is you when you die.
Yeah.
As sculpted as you'll come. So I guess I just wanted to clarify in that imagery that I believe the question is how many people never reach a very sort of defined sculpture.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
They're still chunking it, or chipping away the big blocks.
Yeah. And they might have even ruined some of the inner sculpture by cutting, fracturing sort of center pieces.
I do want, like, all right, so I don't think this is your point, but like I wonder
go.
I wonder what, you know, like this is just my observation, but that like folks tend to go through this like arc maybe of self-discovery or authenticity maybe that sort of fizzles out in older age. I wonder what that's about, you know, like I can think of a few examples in my own life, more than a few, of like a 70 plus person who like sort of regressed into like Fox News, watching, or even CNN on the background of the TV all the time, like sort of like mired and stuck in their ways instead of like continuing to refine and chisel away and like I wonder how you continue the journey of it, like past 40 or past 50, 60, you know, like
right. Well, I mean, there's a legitimate part of our degradation into our death, like ultimately in many trajectories our faculties just diminish and diminish and diminish. I think the question is like how gracefully we accept that and like knowing what our limitations are, but like knowing what our strengths are and really playing to our strengths. I mean, I was just making fun of a bunch of old people that I thought were like, my problem with them is that they just seem so entitled and rude and like in a way that they were just kind of oblivious to interacting, whether they were too close to people in line or they were like there's just so many things about it, and some of it can totally be, in my opinion, ascribed to declining faculties. I think another aspect of it is simply people, they never did that much work. Right? Relatively, like that arc is an arc, but relative to where I want to be in my arc, like they're not touching, like they're not even coming close to that transformation. And I guess for me, I'm not spending a lot of time judging like people's arcs, but I feel like I'm only attracted to those that are riding arcs.
Yeah.
And so the sedentary mental and physical state of someone glued to the television with a vodka tonic, feet up, they're in a fantasy of what they're dealing with a fantasy and a reality of what retirement is.
Yeah.
In my opinion, and so they say, well, I should be enjoying myself. You know what I mean?
Vodka tonic.
Vodka tonic.
Yeah.
Well, TV.
Talking heads. Yeah.
Yeah. Whatever it is, but like, it's a fantasy coupled with a really sad reality that the less they do in the community, the less they go to church or they go to listen to live music, or the less they take their significant other out to dance, or it just becomes less. It just becomes a greater leap to go do those things than to just do what's comfortable. You've atrophied like certain sensibilities and certain activities, like in your soul. But like people die those deaths at 35.
Yeah.
Like, and to me, the guy dying at 71, who lived a great life before that, is way better than someone dying at 35 and then just continuing. So, I don't know. But for me, again, like, all I judge in people is their propensity to change.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, like, within reason, I don't like, oh, this Nazi's got a lot of promise to turn into like a regular caring individual in the next 10 years, so I'm going to give them my respect. But like most people, like you just know when talking to them where they've been, where they're going, and I don't know. So I respect it's a really difficult reality coupled with a really difficult fantasy that keeps people down.
Because I mean, yeah, like change is hard. It's like meaningful change is really, 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 really difficult. And it's almost like it's so difficult, I think, or at least it was for me personally, and for, you know, some folks in my life who've gone through some pretty radical changes as well, that like it's hard for me to judge folks who don't change. Like this old person, you know, this character that we're creating here,
probably named Tom.
You know, still has his high school ring, you know.
Is it pinky or a ring?
Oh,
finger?
maybe it's a pinky one, dude. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Because he was probably a car salesman.
He was the backup quarterback, you know, like saw a little bit of action. If they'd only put him in, they would have won state. But Tom, I think I have a lot of, maybe empathy's not the right word. Pity is not the right word either, definitely. But like sympathy, sympathy. Thank you.
Sympathy.
Yeah. An essayette on sympathy. No, but there's the world has changed in a lot of ways since Tom was my age, since Tom was in high school.
Oh yeah.
And I do wonder, like, if some of this sort of rigidity that a lot of older people take on, this atrophy that you speak of, maybe some of that is like a self-preservation, right? Like, these are the things I know, and what's outside of this is no longer familiar to me anymore. These fucking kids with their nose piercings and their purple hair and you can just have sex all the time now find people that have sex on your phone. Like, it's crazy out in the world for an 80-year-old person, you know, like borderline unrecognizable. And so I do wonder if like what is comfortable is like the terror that's on television and the vodka tonic, you know, like I'm gonna ride this out into the sunset, because trying to change and keep up with the world that surrounds me is fucking hard.
I think that's totally acceptable. And I don't know, I don't want to get too down on Tom, or even talk much further on the elderly.
I could talk about old people all day.
Well, one thing that's wild, like, think about this. 2012, 12 years ago, right?
Yeah.
1980, 1968. That's the same difference. 1968 was to 1980 as 2012 was to us now.
Wait, hold on, one more time.
Okay, 1968 upwards to 1980. It's 12 years difference.
That's 12 years. 1980 to 1992 is 12 years.
Well, yeah, but let's just focus on 2012 to 2024. 12 years ago. we don't think of that time as all that much has changed, right?
Yeah.
But 1968 to 1990, this writer was writing the other day about it, and like, imagine if you took a song from 1980 and brought it back to 1968. They'd be like, poof.
Yeah.
But you do 24 to 12, and they're like, it's kind of...
Right.
Anyway, the point was just...
Well, I work with a lot of young people, I mean, younger than me, right?
Yeah.
In their early 20s. And so, like, the music I grew up listening to was like 80s music or 70s music to me, you know? Like my dad listening to Led Zeppelin is like me listening to, like, I don't know, Pinkerton by Weezer or something, you know, like, which they all make fun of me for listening to. It's like divorced dad rock is what they call it. Like, nah, this is cool. And then I'm repeating the words that my dad said and like his dad said, and like we're all playing a part, you know?
Yeah, I guess all I was getting at was just the idea that time is like the difference between 365 days or 12 years, whatever, right? Like, is different for different people.
Yeah.
But there's objective truths that, like, certain time periods, more shit change.
Yeah.
More rapidly. And that is in support of the idea that maybe Tom is pretty disoriented at this point. Considering, right, like, it was 1950, what we were saying, he was 80? Okay. Yeah, not quite. Okay. Anyway, point is, I don't know what... I mean, I think ideally my statement about what wisdom is true, but it's only for the wise person. Not every old person's wise, I guess is just what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
A lot of them aren't. But there's plenty of wise people that grow very gracefully into that and keep living as hard as they can, as faithfully as they can, until they can't.
And that's the goal.
I think so. I mean, I don't know. Like, I don't know. I don't believe that there's anything else for me other than this time here, that I'm not, not dead. So I don't know. I feel like it's always been like, Sam, that can existentially, like, sort of void you and scare you, or that can propel you to just spend the time doing something, this year that you're going to look back on next year and think fondly of, and as you move in the future,